beautiful introduction and undeserved. Okay, so let me share my screen. Okay, thanks, Alison. Thanks, David, again for organising this really great symposium. It's great to have a chance to talk. I'm going to be talking about the evolution of hidden anti-predatory signals. And this work is very much collaborative with my PhD student. He's just finished, Carl Henry, and Changku Kang, who was a postdoc in the lab. When I say collaborative, I mean that when I say the word we, what I really mean is Carl and Changku. And if I ever use the word I'm meaning either Carl or Changku. So they've been very much instrumental in this work. Okay, many insect species are cryptic at rest and show conspicuous color patterns when approached by a predator. You may know some of these. Here's the lanternfly. Here we've got the mountain katydid. Here we've got a Carolina locust. The phenomenon is also seen in vertebrates, and that suggests some general explanations for why certain signals should be hidden largely and yet exposed under certain conditions. And here are a few little videos. This is lanternfly. This is work from Changku Kang, and you can see those signals are relatively hidden until, in many cases, the organism is touched or under some imminent threat, and then it will signal. And you've probably seen this video. Couldn't resist it because it's a beautiful video from Kate Umbers, and this is the mountain katydid. And you'll see it's a hidden signal being exposed under this condition of being here, in this case, being touched. So why hidden signals? The first point to observe is that it's generally seen in both sexes of a species. We actually have data on this, which I may get back to. But when hidden signals are revealed, in most cases, it's unlikely to be explained by sexual selection because both males and females exhibit the hidden signals. Sometimes they're different hidden signals, but in almost all cases, it's a form of hidden signal. And then secondly, it's generally shown under imminent predation threats. So we've been talking about multiple defenses over the past few days. In many cases, not all, the primary defense is one of camouflage, it's crypsis. And then under some form of threat, a signal is revealed, which is a bit weird. How does that exposure serve to protect prey? Well, there are several explanations, and I want to emphasize that they're somewhat overlapping and not necessarily mutually exclusive. And under certain cases, it's really one explanation rather than another, but in other cases, it's a bit of a blend of two or three. The first explanation is that those hidden signals, when suddenly exposed, might serve to startle a predator, and we'll move on to that. They could also signal unprofitability to a predator. They might make it harder to catch when in motion if that signal is being exposed. And they might also make the prey that exhibits them harder to find when it settles. Well, why aren't these mutually exclusive? Well, sometimes that unprofitability might actually be a case of signaling that it's hard to catch. And sometimes we can see a signal of unprofitability, like a mimetic signal, but also it ends up being harder to find when it settles. So they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. Here's the structure of what I want to do today. I'm keeping an eye on the time. I want to consider an explanation. I want to ask this question, why don't all species use it? When we present work on anti-predator defenses, we show the very finest videos of things working really well. And the view is that, hey, wow, this is a great form of defense. This is a really effective signal. But if these defenses are so effective, such as startle, you might ask, well, what conditions does it work and what doesn't? What conditions won't it work? Because, of course, if it worked all the time, you'd see it in a really widespread sense. And then if we can answer that, why don't all species use it, we can look at phylogenetic evidence for to evaluate whether our interpretation is correct in number 2. So hidden signals as startle displays. We can think of many signals which are revealed under imminent predation threat, which act in a startling manner. Now it's been formally defined in lots of different ways, and in my mind, it's simply a sudden change in appearance that triggers some form of a reflexive withdrawal by the predator. And it's been long known that exposure of a hidden signal, in particular a conspicuous hidden signal, can startle would-be predators. Here's one example. This is a recent example. This is work done with Changku. This is where we use robomoth, which is exposing this hidden signal, and we can, of course, evaluate the responses of these wild birds, in this case, chickadees, and I'll return to this later on. So the important thing I want to note is that every moth has its story. To understand the coloration of every moth, both its forewings and the hind wings, really you need to go down into the weeds and really understand their fine details of their life history. So we're talking big picture here rather than fine details. But let's take the Erebid moths. Some moths will exhibit what we think of as these high contrast hidden signals, such as the one on the right. And other moths will exhibit relatively low contrasts, which look relatively cryptic, whether we look at their forewing or their hind wing. And so we can think of examples of both. And the simple question we can ask is, why? Why do these moths evolve these, and why do those moths tend to be relatively cryptic? If startling is so effective, and of course we've seen with robomoth, why haven't all moths gone for this? Why haven't they evolved these hidden signals? So here's a conjecture. By the way, I actually saw one of these yesterday when I was out walking the dog. This is an underwing moth, relatively large here. It's just sat there on the tree. Here's a conjecture. Maybe it's got something to do with body size, because in larger moths, maybe, and of course, we'll look for evidence in a few minutes, the startle signal is more effective in deterring any would-be predator. And maybe a backup defense is more necessary. Why would it be more necessary? Well, the bigger moths tend to be a little bit easier to see on trees. And maybe to some birds, at least, they're more of a meal. And so they're very much more worth pursuing. We can, of course, formalize these sort of vague qualitative arguments in a model. And because I'm really interested in modeling, I'm going to give you some, some toy models to think about. And this is going back to a sort of defensive portfolio. And I'm looking at reproduction just at the end of some series of survival events. So if you get to the end of the season, lucky you, you can breed. So let's have a look at the daily or the overall probability of surviving a predatory encounter. And here's the primary defense, which might be crypsis. And here is the secondary defense, which might be some form of display, like the startle display. So the overall probability of surviving is the probability of your first defense working, but then this is the probability of the first defense failing, but the second defense working too, like that. So that's the survival per predatory encounter. How many encounters will a prey have with their predators? Well, it might be something like this. It might be Poisson distributed. So some lucky prey are going to have no encounters with predators. Some really unlucky prey are going to have a lot. It might be randomly distributed like this. And so we can sum all of this. This is S to the power I. So this is for the number of survival events it's got to live for. And here is the Poisson part. And because we've got values which are always less than 1, this will sum to a finite number. And we've got a really simple value there for the overall survivorship of an organism with a primary and a secondary defense when you've got a Poisson number of encounters with predators. Let's turn that into fitness, and because we've got the Semmelparis case, we're going to have a certain number of births there if you manage, lucky you, to survive to the end of the season. But I'm going to add a little cost here, and this cost is TOR, and that cost is the cost of having that secondary defense. We can ask, under what conditions would it pay to actually invest that value TOR in order to get that value PS? Well, it turns out that the answer is pretty intuitive, and it's the one that we got to just a few minutes ago. You only pay that cost to ensure a secondary defense if the primary defense is really crap, i.e. you really do need that secondary defense to back you up, or the effectiveness of that secondary defense is really high. So we can see that through this sort of very simple mathematical model. Either you really need it or it's really effective, and that blend of the two can determine whether it's worth paying that cost or not in order to get that secondary defense. And of course, that cost could come in all sorts of forms. It might be manufacturing pigments, it could be anything else. Okay, so let's move back to these moths now and actually ask whether body size does indeed explain the color patterns, whether some have got these contrasting and others have got the non-contrasting. Here are the Erebid moths. We've got 201 species there. And it turns out that, yes, indeed, there is a relationship that you can just about pick out. And this, I should say, is done with both ImageJ and with human classification, of course, based in the visible part of the spectrum. Here, when we've got contrasting wings, they tend to be a little bit larger than those moths without the contrasting wings. But there's a bit of a problem, and the problem is that sometimes you'll get moths which are not really cryptic, could be classed as aposematic both in the, or at least conspicuous in both the forewing and the hindwing. And for that, we needed humans to be able to classify between them, and we still see that overall pattern. So moths with hidden contrasting signals do indeed tend to be bigger. Every moth has its story. This is just big picture views for, oh, we see something startling. There is some association with body size. So the question is, are startle signals by large moths more effective than startle signals by small moths? Well, to answer that, we can do some field experiments, and these field experiments were done largely by Changku Kang using what we grew to call RoboMoth. And RoboMoth was a Bluetooth controlled moth, artificial moth, of course, that opens its wings when we pressed at a certain time. And we then looked at the behavior of the chickadees. So here's what we did. We looked at small or large, that's what we were mainly interested in, and contrasting versus non-contrasting, where we've got gray here versus red there. Our hypothesis was that this would produce a much higher response than something like this. Here it is again. I should say that this is one of the funnest experiments. This is why I got into biology, scaring birds and watching what happens when you open these wings. Okay. So let's have a look at the data. And the data are here. This is the initial survivorship. There was a mealworm that was placed, and we simply wanted to know, well, did the mealworm survive that first encounter or not? Well, when they were small, there was no real difference between the contrasting and the non-contrasting. But when they were large, almost always, the contrasting moth scared the hell out of the birds, whereas the non-contrasting moth did not. So we found a significant effect of body size there. So the contrasting hindwings are more beneficial in larger moths. There's an Achilles heel to startle, and that is we can see habituation arise. This is work by my colleague Jane Yak and Amanda Ducky. This is actually a sound, and it's startling the red-winged blackbird, but after a while, sound is made, not impressed at all. It's not affected its response. We can go back to our predatory experiment with the chickadees and look what happened here. This is over time. This is unfortunately at flock level because we couldn't discriminate between the individual birds within a flock. This is the mean startle score over 20 mealworms presented. And the thing to note here is this is the small ones, and this is the large ones with the contrasting signals in blue there. And here, perhaps more importantly, is the survivorship of the mealworm. We see up here, survivorship is relatively high and yet seems to be maintained, although there is a degree of habituation. The habituation is far less for the small moths with no contrasting signals. So flock level habituation arose, but it was significantly slower for those larger moths with the contrasting colors. So why does large size make the display more effective and less prone to habituation? Well, the answer is really obvious. I'm not even going to dress it up in signal detection theory here, because basically larger displayers have a capacity to do more harm to you if they turn out to be bad. And it's likely, I think, that that's the reason why large size makes a more effective startle display. It's predominantly more dangerous to you if it turned out to be something like a genuine threat. A small moth opening its wings, not so impressed, because it couldn't do very much to you if it was really very small. So I'm going to talk about future work here, and I want to talk about diurnal butterflies, because what we've done so far is contrast the forewing and hindwing of moths, because of course that's the way they tend to rest. But diurnal butterflies do something very different. Here the contrast is very much more a dorsal ventral or upper side, lower side, because they tend to rest with their wings vertical rather than their wings laid flat. Just like the moths, every butterfly has its story, but maybe some butterflies will adopt a dual anti-predator signaling strategy, one signal when it's rest, and that might actually be crypsis, and yet another signal when it's moving. Well, why would it have to have another signal when it's moving? Well, already through movement, it's broken a degree of its crypsis. There are a limit to which it can hide. And under these cases, that secondary defense might kick in because the primary defense is not, or the primary signal is no longer very useful. And it's been talked about for quite a while. In fact, you can trace, like most things, back to Poulton. Here's Jim Mallett and Singer talking about unpalatable butterflies like the heliconids and ithymines, tending to be similarly colored on both their dorsal and ventral side. And Peng Chai also talked about many acceptable butterflies having cryptic undersides, and sometimes they're having these conspicuous upper sides. There's a really nice paper out by Pinheiro, and it was out a year or two ago in Ecological Entomology, who classified butterflies not just in terms of aposematic and cryptic, but actually started to use this dual description of the signaling strategy. And indeed, what he argued is that many of these unpalatable species were actually, both their dorsal and ventral sides were both relatively conspicuously colored, and they tended to be rejected on site by wild jacamars, and that's whether they were flying or at rest. These guys, on the other hand, have got this dual signaling strategy where their dorsal side is really quite conspicuous and their ventral side is really very cryptic. Now, it turns out that when you observe jacamars, and I should say that the sample size is relatively limited, and in this case, there wasn't any phylogenetic controls. But it turns out that this combination, they tended to be rejected and sometimes pursued, but not very vigorously. But they were attacked when they were cryptic, but they were not attacked in the air. And then there was this group here, which tended to be attacked, whether they were in the air or cryptic. This is for future work, but I think we need a conceptual framework to understand these dual signaling strategies. And I think butterflies give us a great opportunity because, you know, it's well known the dorsal ventral sides can differ, and sometimes it's due to sexual selection, but down to predation alone, we still need to understand why it's helpful to show off your warning signals at both cases when you're unpalatable and so on. Okay, so many hidden signals, and I just showed you some examples there, like the blue morphos are exposed only in motion. And here's the Carolina locus, which is very common around here in Ottawa. And it's one of the things that really got us started thinking about these hidden signals. When it's at rest, it's very cryptic, but when it moves, it's like this. It's really quite conspicuous, and then when it rests, it comes back down like that. I was going to show you that video, but I'm running a little bit out of time. This is it's flying around. It's not very impressive, but it takes a bit of time, so I'm going to move on. So, what are the explanations for this type of phenomenon? Well, my view and that of Carl and Chancuzo, there's a variety of levels of deception going on here, and they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. The first very strong possibility, and Carl now has as gathering quantitative information in wind tunnels, is that there's a degree of evasive mimicry going on, that this particular Carolina locus really does fly very similarly to a butterfly, and in particular we have the morning cloak around here in Ottawa, and it's possible that there's a degree of evasive mimicry, and evasive mimicry has been reported before in cases with a grasshopper and a butterfly. The idea being that the butterflies may be somewhat harder to catch than the grasshopper. And so if you look like something harder to catch, both in terms of your morphology and also your behavior, then maybe birds will tend to leave you alone. And of course, I'm looking forward. I know there's 1 or 2 talks about evasive mimicry, I think tomorrow or the day after. And here's just one example. This thing here is sacrovagid fly. I don't think you need much evidence to show that that's pretty good at avoiding predators. But here we've got a weevil here that seems to me has evolved a very close resemblance to the sacrovagid fly, and it's likely a case of evasive mimicry. But there's another form of mimicry, and I want to give credit to Carl here for coming up with this idea. I just painted it in the theory, but it was Carl's idea that maybe we could have another form of mimicry, which is related, but not the same as evasive mimicry. And it's a form of mutualistic mimicry due to different capture techniques. And let me explain. So here's a bee shrimp. It's found in China, and the bee shrimp is quite clearly conspicuous colors. It tends to co-occur in China with this panda loach, which also has the same black and white patterning. And interestingly, when the panda loach gets too large or it gets big, it loses that color pattern. So it's only at a certain stage in its life does it have that. Well, if a bee shrimp is getting close to a predator, its main way of avoiding is to head backwards. It's a shrimp, it heads back, whereas a panda loach will go forwards. So that gives you a bit of a problem if you're a predator. If you're a little bit confused, you would probably, if you knew it was a shrimp, you would attack behind. And if you knew it was a loach, you would go and attack ahead. But if there's a degree of confusion, maybe you could choose the wrong anti-predator strategy for the given prey. This we can dress up as a signal detection theory. Here's the shrimp. Here's its overall appearance when sampled. It's somewhere from this normal distribution. And there on the side is, on the right, is the loach. So here is the proportion of shrimp in the environment. And this is the probability, the optimal probability given by signal detection theory of striking behind. If there was 100% shrimp, then you should always strike behind. If there was 0% shrimp, then you should never strike behind, and so on. Why is there this difference? Well, it's just because we can probabilistically determine we can probabilistically discriminate between shrimp and loach. So that's the probability of striking behind. So sometimes you're using, because you've just got the wrong view, the wrong attack approach for that given type of prey. And of course, it turns out in terms of capture success. So it's mutualistic in many cases. The worst it can be is commensal, where it doesn't really affect the other prey species. But in almost all these cases, when there's an intermediate proportion of shrimp, the predator's using the wrong attack strategy on at least a proportion of times because it thinks it might be a loach and it's a shrimp, or vice versa. And so we call that mutualistic deceptive mimicry. But there's probably another even more important, and by the way, we're not sure whether the Carolina locust fills in that particular case. It could well be just a case of evasive mimicry, but it's something to think about, and certainly something to think about with butterfly species, whether certain butterfly species might be caught in different ways, and whether that mimicry is not really Batesian evasive mimicry, but more of this type of mimicry where the capture technique is really an important determinant of the evolution of the mimicry. Okay, there is another form of deception, and I think this deception could well be relatively widespread. It's a decoy. So when you see something flying in the air, you might tend to think it's conspicuous. And so when you think, oh, okay, I'm going to go and see if I can find that, if it's reverted to its cryptic state, you might actually think it's actually disappeared or gone because you're expecting to find something nice and bright red or black, and yet it's reverted to its cryptic state. It's something of a decoy. So working with Carl and Chanku and also Tim Caro, we developed a simple proof of concept idea where we decided to have prey, here they are, moving across the screen and then settling in an area. And sometimes these prey were brightly colored or appeared brightly colored, but they settled cryptic. They were the flashers. And other times they were just purely cryptic all the way through. And here is some training prey. I'm going to just show you what that looks like. So there it's flown by. You go in and hit it there, click, and you're moving on, and so on and so forth. So we had this very simple proof of concept idea, and what we found was that the individual prey that were flashing, that were showing these bright colors as they moved, tend to have a higher survivorship in that area where they settled, simply because the predators, in this case human predators, were expecting to find something conspicuous. They couldn't find it, obviously, and so they gave up, and yet it was still there. It just reverted to its cryptic state. Here is what happens when a cryptic species moves across. You see it's cryptic, and so when it settles, you are looking for something cryptic, and so the survivorship is that much less. And it works on a whole variety of different backgrounds too. We did grass and sand. Now, I don't really, human schmoomans, after a while, there's a limit to what you can learn from humans. And Chanku has recently developed some simple techniques to use more natural predators, which are chicks. And I thought I'd show you this because it gets across the idea. There is a little bit of an introduction. And in a second, you should see, there it is, there. So the chick has obviously chased after something conspicuous, looking to find it, and then it's disappeared, and so it is giving up. And as I say, this is still preliminary, but the intention is to repeat some of the basic work that's been done with humans and see whether it also applies to these chicks. Okay, so what are the conditionalities here? And the first obvious thing is to look at body size. Does body size explain the success of this decoy effect? And it turns out it does. Small prey, these are tiny prey moving across the screen, and this is again with human predators, don't gain very much at all from flashing, and that's because they're really hard to find anyway, and so the additional benefit of having that flash is really quite small. But large prey do indeed benefit considerably. Why is that? Well, it's just because the larger prey, the big prey, are much easier to find than those small prey. So that difference there is always going to be small compared to a difference there of flashing. There is probably an upper limit on body size too, where you're too ridiculously large, you'll be seeing whatever decoy you tend to use, but we've found a simple size effect here. Okay, so bigger prey make you better startlers, and bigger prey benefit more from the decoy effect. So you might expect to see these size relationships in terms of hidden conspicuous signals very commonly. And this is indeed the case. When you actually examine using similar methods as we've used with the Erebid moths, but you look at a wide range of groups. Here's the Orthoptera, the mantids, the phasmids, and we've got the saturnids and sphingids. We found evidence in 4 of those 5 groups of a significant relationship between body size and their use of these contrasting colors. And again, most of this work is just done on image J, looking at the degree of contrast between the forewings and the hind wings of these species. So, are there any other correlates that might be expected rather than just body size? There's always body size. Surely there's something else we could think about. Well, there's an interesting paper on species-specific escape behavior in grasshoppers by Butler. And here is the pattern that Carl detected with this particular group of species. There are only 9 species, but it was looking at the flight initiation distance, the distance, the median distance at which the orthopterans would fly away when approached by a human. We've of course all seen things fleeing, but you can measure that distance. Well, here using image J is the hidden contrasting signals. Here, these are the species with, and this is the Carolina locust here, with the largest flight initiation distance. And some of these individuals, species down here, have relatively low flight initiation distance. And we wondered why that might be. One possibility is that if you see that flasher before it changes its state from cryptic to conspicuous, maybe the game is up. Maybe the decoy effect is going to be less effective because you've actually seen the trick. You've seen it move from cryptic to conspicuous. So when it settles again, you're expecting something cryptic. And of course, you can put this to the test because it also helps to actually test the underlying mechanism. And so this is what we did. We had a simple idea where we ran these experiments again with humans. This is a flash displayer with a low FID. I'm going to see if I can get this to work there. So as soon as the mouse gets close, it's moving. But because you're waiting until the mouse gets really close, you're actually seeing it in this cryptic state before it moves. But here is one with high FID. It's moved long before you've actually found it on the screen. And then we've got the no flash, which is just pretty much the same. And here's the high FID. So you get all of that. Simple experiment where we're manipulating the flight initiation distance of this prey and also whether they're flashing or not. And here are the results, really strong effect. When you couple the flasher with a high FID, you'll see a much higher survivorship, almost twice the height, the size than the other sets of conditions, which are pretty indiscriminable. So when you've got a flasher, but you've got to virtually come close to touch it before it changes its state, the effect is really very limited. Okay, so how can we put this to the test? And it's clear Orthoptera are a possibility, but there are only 9 species out there. There are a lot of studies of flight initiation distance, and one of the best, because it's really well replicated and intensively studied, is that of birds. This is work by Dan Blumstein, Australian birds, some of which show what we would think of as flash colors. And I'm going to move on to even more explanations for why these flash colors arise. Please don't come with the view that it's all this decoy effect, but this is what we wanted to test. We wanted to test whether there's a relationship between the use of these flash signals and this FID. And surprisingly, that has not been evaluated before, whether anything to do with flashing is related to FID. I should say my money was on there being no relationship at all, but it turned out that there was a relationship. Of course, you need to classify the birds as whether they are flashers, whether they expose any hidden signals when they're flying versus not. And we had replicated trials where we were trying to classify them and work through lots of different forms of classification. The overall result is this. Here's the FID, that flight initiation distance, and here's the body mass. The big picture is that bigger birds tend to have longer flight initiation distances, and that's been known before. But here on top, this analysis of covariance, of course, this is all controlling for phylogeny. This is the flashers, and this is the non-flashers. And so with the flashers, you're tending to have a higher flight initiation distance for your size than the non-flashers. So FID increased with body size and was higher in birds with hidden colors. But let's not get too carried away because we don't really know what the mechanisms are, and the mechanism could be multiple. It's quite possible that when you've got high predation pressure, you flee from a distance, but also you evolve for whatever reason these flash displays. They may not all be about decoys. Few of them may be about decoys. It might be about pursuit, deterrence, etc. Which brings me on to the final little bit, which is perfect. There are a number of explanations for these hidden signals. And of course, I've talked briefly about the mimicry and startle, and in particular the decoys. But there's another explanation, and I want to give a shout out to Gopal Murali, who's been doing some really interesting work on the idea that signaling while you're moving can also create some form of confusion effect, which makes it a little bit harder for would-be predators, in this case humans have been used, to actually capture you while you're in motion. I should say that the conditions under which this work are relatively limited. Gopal himself, when he was doing his work, only found it under certain conditions, and we tried to get that type of effect, and we simply couldn't. So it's quite possible that it only occurs in some conditions, but of course rainforests are really complicated environments with lots of lights and dapples and so on. So there's quite possibly something really interesting going on. It's just hard to pin down. Okay, so to conclude, many species reveal previously hidden signals when approached by predators. There are, of course, several benefits from exposing those signals, not necessarily mutually exclusive. The need for those signals and the benefit from those signals is conditional on other aspects of life history. I've talked about body size, the way body size tends to generate selection, possibly because it's needed more, but certainly from our evidence with regard to startle displays and decoys, because it's more effective. But there are other conditions too, such as the need to move. If you are a certain type of moth that is continually in a certain refuge, then you probably won't need a form of hidden signal. So as I said, this is big picture, looking at overall broad effects rather than specifically trying to predict any individual moth or butterfly, etc. And that conditionality can be tested by experiment, of course, but also further evaluated using those comparative methods. So it just remains to, again, shout out to Carl and Chanku, who've both been very instrumental in this work. And I'm happy to take questions.
Thanks so much, Tom. Thanks for your wonderful talk. I would say as per usual.